Myself and twin brothers Carl and Keith Johnson make up the August group known as the Poe and Lovecraft Society of Rhode Island. And we put on between 3 and 4 presentations a year. Certainly, we do this Poe tribute this time of year, and then an outdoor one in October. And coming up on the weekend of April 5th at the gravesite of H.P. Lovecraft in Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, we will have a tribute to that author as well. Why Poe and Lovecraft? Well, they both have connections to Rhode Island. Certainly, especially H.P. Lovecraft, who was born and bred in Providence, and Edgar Allan Poe spent time in Providence as well. We have some idea that maybe Lovecraft might have spent some time with acquaintances in Scituate and certainly in Foster, so there's some connection there. There is no direct connection to Poe with Scituate. That connection lies with his brothers Johnson and myself, who were residents for some years. So I'd like to begin our presentation with a little bit of biographical data about Edgar Allan Poe. And the title of our presentation today is Edgar Allan Poe's Blustery Birthday Bash, since his birthday was just passed on the 19th of January. We originally used that title some years back, by the way, for a presentation we did this time of year on the banks of the river in Providence, and came to regret that because it was just a little bit more blustery than we signed up for. So hence more humble indoor digs for this. Although we are promised some wind later in the day, so the blustery part should hold true. And with that, few writers in the annals of popular horror, mystery, and suspense literature, past or present, can equal the mystique and renown achieved by American author and poet Edgar Allan Poe, born on January the 19th of 1809 and died October the 7th of 1849. Poe is credited with originating the short story format and inventing the modern detective story. He was the first author to earn a living, albeit at times scantily, exclusively from writing. By no means has his popularity diminished over the ensuing years, since his untimely demise at the age of 40. The cause of Poe's death in Baltimore, Maryland, remains uncertain. Indeed, Edgar Poe merited his reputation as a rebel writer imbued with a darkly poetic spirit. Misconceptions about Edgar Allan Poe endure. Some of those were sparked by Poe's first and highly critical biographer Rufus Wilmot Griswold, who even while Poe lived seemed to have a proverbial axe to grind against his subject. He did so effectively and posthumously, exaggerating Poe's fondness for liquor and narcotics with a libelous vigor. The image of a homely, rather frail fellow whose facial muscles seemed incapable of raising that black caterpillar of a mustache hung over his lips into a smile is how most imagined him. Would any think him a handsome and athletic specimen? He was in fact both, especially as a younger man, and undeniably he possessed a measure of personal charm. The trademark mustache was a later affectation he sported only during the last 6 years of his life. Possessed of a singular appearance, his features bore the stamp of brooding and sorrow, and it seemed regret cooled in his deep-set eyes. Regarding his expansive forehead, which seemed to have accounted for more than half of his face, Poe was indeed well endowed. Poe did wield a poisoned pen, attacking fellow writers and literary critics at every turn, himself publishing scathing reviews strewn with slurs. He appeared to cultivate a genuine talent for reversing advantages which came his way. Ralph Waldo Emerson dismissed Poe's writing style as being shallow and superfluous, dubbing him that jingle man. However, Edgar Poe did win a measure of literary acclaim, even fame, during his lifetime, and was a darling of the literary circuit. No recordings of his voice exist, of course. Yet, it was observed that many admiring persons, fans, if you will, women especially, flocked to hear his presentations delivered in darkened rooms. Poe's only marriage was marred by tragedy. In 1842, his wife Virginia ruptured a blood vessel, the first sign of the tuberculosis that plagued her short life. In an effort to cope with her illness and the stress of his failing finances, Poe occasionally turned to alcohol. He repented after each binge, but his employers and friends took note. Poe later observed of this tortuous time, "I took leave of her forever, and underwent all the agonies of her death. She recovered partially, and again I hoped. At the end of the year, the vessel broke, then again, and yet again. I became insane, with horrible intervals of sanity. In his mid to later 30s, Edgar Allan Poe spent some time in his native city of Boston and in Providence, Rhode Island during periods in 1848 and 1849, primarily while engaged in a courtship of the eccentric Providence poetess and heiress Sarah Helen Power Whitman. Poe had been told of the alluring Mrs. Whitman on one July day in 1845, but his intel was sketchy, right? A little bit dark in here. I'm going to get a little bit more light.
Get some lights in here.
Actually, this is fine for now. Okay. He first beheld the widow, Mrs. Whitman, one July day in 1845 while strolling along Benefit Street in the company of his friend Francis Sargent Osgood, whose lecture in Providence he had attended. There, just outside her residence located at the corner of Benefit and Church Streets, he saw Sarah Helen on her doorstep. Edgar was instantly smitten, but declined an introduction the next day offered by Mrs. Osgood, and at the same time believing the object of his entrancement to be married. Poe had reimagined her clad in a diaphanous white nightgown, tending her rose garden by moonlight, the way he had dreamt of the encounter, and inspired by this vision, Poe wrote his poem To Helen, the second one to be so titled. In fact, prior to their first meeting, Sarah Helen's friend Annie Lynch requested that she write a poem for an 1848 Valentine's Day party, and Sarah Helen composed a verse she titled To Edgar Allan Poe. Although Poe himself was not present for the recitation, he did receive a copy of the verse. In response to her Valentine poem, he anonymously sent her a copy of the first version to Helen, which was originally written about another woman, Mrs. Craig Stith Standard. Upon their first in-person meeting, Poe divulged to Sarah Helen that he was indeed the poem's author. Whitman, who moved in transcendentalist circles, shared the same macabre sense of humor as Poe. Fittingly, for her eccentric nature, she wore a coffin-shaped charm on a necklace. She and Poe also shared the same birthday, though she was 6 years older than him. They quickly grew fond of each other and formed a relationship of mutual admiration which soon blossomed into romance. Her mother, Anna Marsh Power, who distrusted all men, disapproved of their union, but Poe, ever the opportunist and perhaps genuinely enamored, pressed on. When Poe was in Providence, the couple would meet clandestinely within the Athenaeum Library along Benefit Street. During one of these meetings, Whitman expressed her admiration of the poem Ulalume, published without the author's name in the American Whig Review in 1847. Poe admitted he was the author and signed his name on the library's copy. Years later, Whitman returned to the library, found it on the shelves, and it is now part of their special collections. Eventually, Mrs. Power begrudgingly consented to Poe's request for the lady's hand in matrimony, but only on the proviso that upon their wedding, her daughter would be disinherited. In gentlemanly fashion, Poe agreed to this disheartening condition imposed by his prospective mother-in-law. Their engagement ultimately was broken off, likely because Poe broke a promise to abstain from alcohol. Either Mrs. Power or Sarah Helen had made him promise as a condition of the engagement. An anonymous tipster sent Whitman a letter disclosing that Poe had been seen drinking. Upon the news and confronting Poe, she inhaled ether from her handkerchief and passed out, with her last words to Poe, "I love you." In a letter to Whitman written a month later, Poe blamed her mother for the broken engagement. During this period, and as it would be late in his life, Poe engaged in a series of rather bizarre flirtations, writing love letters to numerous women, some of them quite married. On one trip to Richmond in 1849, he met with his boyhood sweetheart, Elmira Royster, by then widowed, and begged her to marry him. The two seemed to have reached a verbal agreement of sorts when Poe departed, promising to return promptly. He never would. On September the 28th of 1849, after going missing for several days, as it was conjectured having boarded a train on his way back to Philadelphia, Poe was found in a gutter outside a Baltimore tavern, unconscious, filthy, and dressed in strange, ill-fitting clothes, not his own. How he arrived there and that way remains a mystery, although theories of foul play, alcohol poisoning, rabies, and chicken cooping have all been proffered. For those who don't know what that term chicken cooping means, it was actually a vote early, vote often scheme where someone would be held captive, changed into multiple sets of clothing, and made to vote for a candidate multiple times. He regained consciousness the next day in Washington College Hospital, but was incoherent, trembling, and ranting. After a period of violent delirium in which he seemed to fight against ghosts, Poe at last grew calm with exhaustion. Shortly before sunrise on October 7th, America's misfit poet cried weakly, "Lord, help my poor soul," and died. He was 40 years old. That is the account we have, and probably is closest to the facts. The official cause of his death was listed as brain congestion. He was buried in Baltimore in the cemetery outside of Westminster Hall, initially next to his grandfather at the back of the cemetery. In 1875, he was reinterred in the front of the cemetery. His wife, Virginia, later moved next to him in 1885. Through the years, there have been persons who have reported seeing the spectral figure of a man resembling Edgar Allan Poe sitting on the steps of the Athenaeum as they drove or strolled by. On at least one occasion, this phantom was heard to speak, reciting lines from Poe's poem, The Conqueror Worm. Was this merely a fanciful Poe imposter, or did a favored few, in the words of Providence's own H.P. Lovecraft, espy the shade of Poe?
Thank you.
Now I will ask Carl Johnson to read a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, A Dream Within a Dream. Maybe we could have some more light at this point, since
Yes.
those last few sentences were a little bit of a challenge. If I can find all the switch. Oh. A little bit of a mood breaker, but we won't go long.
I'll move into the light, yeah. They won't allow candlelight here. You can get away with that. A Dream Within a Dream by Edgar Allan Poe. Take this kiss upon the brow, and in parting from you now, this much let me avow. You are not wrong who deem that my days have been a dream. Yet if hope has flown away, in a night or in a day, in a vision or in none, is it therefore the less gone? All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. I stand amid the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand grains of the golden sand. How few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep. While I weep, oh God, can I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? Oh God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream?
All right, I'm going to read you one of Poe's more gruesome stories.
Oh,
And
it's in the mood.
the name of this story is The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Voldemar. Some backdrop on this story is apropos, because when this story was published, it was assumed by many to be a scientific account of something that really happened. And there are features about it that, if you listen carefully, you'll note might have made it more plausible to people, because throughout it, Poe refers to certain characters in sort of an anonymous fashion, Dr. D and Dr. F, as if he is concealing, for the sake of avoiding unwanted publicity, the actual characters' identities. It concerns the pseudoscience of mesmerism, which during Poe's lifetime was held with much credence as being something believable. And so this story, phantasmagoric as it is to our ears today, could have found a lot of believers at the time. And Poe took quite some time before revealing that it was in fact a hoax. I think I will take steps to read a little easier here. The facts in the case of Monsieur Voldemar. Of course, I shall not pretend to consider it any matter for wonder that the extraordinary case of Monsieur Valdemar has excited discussion. It would have been a miracle had it not, especially under the circumstances. Through the desire of all parties concerned to keep the affair from the public, at least for the present, or until we had further opportunities for investigation through our endeavors to this effect, a garbled or exaggerated account made its way into society and became the source of many unpleasant misrepresentations, and very naturally, a source of a great deal of disbelief. It is now rendered necessary that I give the facts, as far as I comprehend them myself. They are succinctly these. My attention for the last 3 years has been repeatedly drawn to the subject of mesmerism, and about 9 months ago, it occurred to me quite suddenly that in the series of experiments made hitherto, there had been a very remarkable and most unaccountable omission. No person had as yet been mesmerized in articulo mortis. It remained to be seen first whether in such condition there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the magnetic influence. Secondly, whether if any existed, it was impaired or increased by the condition. Thirdly, to what extent and for how long a period the encroachments of death might be arrested by the process. There were other points to be ascertained, but these most excited my curiosity, the last in especial, from the immensely important character of its consequences. In looking around me for some subject by whose means I might test these particulars, I was brought to think of my friend, Mr. Ernest Valdemar, the well-known compiler of the Bibliotheca Forensica, and author, under the nom de plume of Issachar Marx, of the Polish versions of Wallenstein and Gargantua. Monsieur Valdemar, who had resided principally in Harlem, New York since the year 1839, is, or rather was, particularly noticeable for the extreme spareness of his person. I may need some of that cider in a moment. His lower limbs, much resembling those of John Randolph, and also for the whiteness of his whiskers, in violent contrast to the blackness of his hair, the latter, in consequence, being very generally mistaken for a wig. His temperament was markedly nervous, and rendered him a good subject for mesmeric experiment. On 2 or 3 occasions, I had put him to sleep with little difficulty, but was disappointed in other results which his peculiar constitution had naturally led me to anticipate. His will was at no period positively or thoroughly under my control, and in regard to clairvoyance, I could accomplish with him nothing to be relied upon. I always attributed my failure at these points to the disordered state of his health. Thank you. For some months prior to him becoming acquainted with me, his physicians had declared him in a confirmed crisis. It was his custom indeed to speak calmly of his approaching dissolution, as if a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. When the ideas to which I have alluded first occurred to me, it was of course very natural that I should think of Monsieur Valdemar. I knew the steady philosophy of the man too well to apprehend any scruples from him, and he had no relatives in America who would be likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and to my surprise, his interest seemed vividly excited. I say to my surprise, for although he had always yielded his person freely to my experiments, he had never before given me any tokens of sympathy with what I had did. His disease was of that character which would admit of exact calculation in respect to the epoch of its termination in death, and it was finally arranged between us that he would send for me about 24 hours before the period announced by his physicians as that of his decease. It is now rather more than 7 months since I received from Monsieur Valdemar himself the subjoined note. My dear P, you may as well come now. D and F are agreed that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow midnight, and I think they have hit the time very nearly. Valdemar. I received this note within half an hour after it was written, and in 15 minutes more, I was at the dying man's chamber. I had not seen him for 10 days, and was appalled by the fearful alteration which the brief interval had wrought in him. His face wore a leaden hue. The eyes were utterly lusterless, and the emaciation was so extreme that the skin had been broken through by the cheekbones. His expectoration was excessive. The pulse was barely perceptible. He retained, nevertheless, in a very remarkable manner, both his mental power and a certain degree of physical strength. He spoke with distinctness, took some palliative medicines without aid, and, when I entered the room, was occupied in penciling memoranda in a pocketbook. He was propped up in the bed by pillows. Doctors D and F were in attendance. After pressing Valdemar's hand, I took these gentlemen aside and obtained from them a minute account of the patient's condition. The left lung had been for 18 months in a semi-osseous or cartilaginous state, and was, of course, entirely useless for all purposes of vitality. The right, in its upper portion, was also partially, if not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was merely a mass of purulent tubercles running one into another. Several extensive perforations existed, and at one point permanent adhesion to the ribs had taken place. These appearances in the right lobe were of comparatively recent date. The ossification had proceeded with very unusual rapidity. No sign of it had been discovered a month before, and the adhesions had only been observed during the 3 previous days. Independent of this phthisis, the patient was suspected of aneurysm of the aorta, but on this point the osseous symptoms rendered an exact diagnosis impossible. It was the opinion of both physicians that Monsieur Valdemar would die about midnight on the morrow, Sunday. It was then 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. On quitting the invalid's bedside to hold conversation with myself and doctors D and F, had bidden him a final farewell. It had not been their intention to return, but at my request, they agreed to look in upon the patient about 10 the next evening. When they had gone, I spoke freely with Monsieur Valdemar on the subject of his approaching dissolution, as well as, more particularly, of the experiment proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. A male and a female nurse were in attendance, but I did not feel myself altogether at liberty to engage in a task of this character with no more reliable witnesses than these people, in case of sudden accident might prove. I therefore postponed the operations until about 8 the next night, when the arrival of a medical student with whom I had some acquaintance, Mr. Theodore L., relieved me from further embarrassment. It had been my design, originally, to wait for the physicians, but I was induced to proceed, first, by the urgent entreaties of Monsieur Valdemar, and secondly, by my conviction that I had not a moment to lose, as he was evidently sinking fast. Mr. L. was so kind as to accede to my desire that he would take notes of all that occurred, and it is from his memoranda that what I have now to relate is, for the most part, either condensed or copied verbatim. It wanted about 5 minutes of 8 when, taking the patient's hand, I begged him to state, as distinctly as he could, to Mr. L. whether he, Monsieur Valdemar, was entirely willing that I should make the experiment of mesmerizing him in his then condition. He replied feebly, yet quite audibly, "Yes, I wish to be mesmerized," adding immediately afterward, "I fear you have deferred it too long." While he spoke thus, I commenced the passes which I had already found most effectual in subduing him. He was evidently influenced with the first lateral stroke of my hand across his forehead. But although I exerted all my powers, no further perceptible effect was induced until some minutes after 10 o'clock, when doctors D and F called, according to appointment. I explained to them in a few words what I designed, and as they opposed no objection, saying that the patient was already in the death agony, I proceeded without hesitation, exchanging, however, the lateral passes for downward ones, and directing my gaze entirely into the right eye of the sufferer. By this time, his pulse was imperceptible, and his breathing was stertorous, and at times of half a minute. This condition was nearly unaltered for a quarter of an hour. At the expiration of this period, however, a natural, although a very deep sigh escaped the bosom of the dying man, and the stertorous breathing ceased. That is to say, its stertorousness was no longer apparent. The intervals were undiminished. The patient's extremity were of an icy coldness. At 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of the mesmeric influence. The glassy roll of the eye was changed for that of an expression of uneasy inward examination, which is never seen except in cases of sleepwalking, and which it is quite impossible to mistake.